Thank you. Shantum, Seth, wonderful to have you here and to share this space with you and to be aware that right at this moment we have the reverberations of the sound of the bell coming from India through this flat here where I'm visiting in London, all the way to the US where the bulk of our viewers are. And how wonderful that we're kind of connecting in a way the world together. Shantum is someone I've really just met in the last year, but I feel very lucky to have met him, and very much like a brother already. We have many connections overlapping, so it's a thrill for me to have him here today. And we'll be talking, as usual, we'll talk some about the Golden Civilization, but I also want to ask, Shantum has a very unusual life and has had at least three figures that I think almost all of us will be familiar with, the names of them, who have been a major influence on his life. And I would love to talk with him about those as well. Let me just say one more thing and then give Shantum a chance to introduce himself. What Shantum is doing now in the world is introducing people to the path that the Buddha took, the actual physical path that the Buddha took in India, and takes people, guides groups along that path. And along the way, I think in every way, aspires to experience the Buddha inside himself so that he can also share how he would imagine that the Buddha would have been in these places. So that's at least what he shared with me. And what I was most moved by, among many things in Shantum's life. Shantum, please correct anything that I've said. Tell us the truth about yourself. And please introduce yourself to begin, and then we'll wander.
Yeah. No, George, thank you for having me on this show. I think I feel a sort of kindred spirit with you, even though we met recently through our daughters, actually, who are studying the same school. But I feel that what you've been trying to do is trying to cultivate a sort of vision for what you call a golden civilization, but it's also been called other things in other ways by people like Gandhi. He talked about the Ram Rajya, not a Hindu Rajya, but a sort of ideal state. So this has happened over centuries, and I feel that it's very important that we can envision our future, both as an individual, as a clan, a family, and also, of course, as a collective civilization. And I've had a sort of interesting little past in a way, like all of us do. I started in the corporate world. I was brought up in a relatively privileged way in India. I went to the sort of so-called best schools and the best university. But then India lost all its freedom in terms of political freedom in 1975, and I left India to go to England. There I became a shoemaker, and I studied how to be a shoemaker. And then by 1979, on the 5th of May, I remember Margaret Thatcher got elected, and for some other causes and conditions besides that, I had a very bad car crash in an MG sports car. And I woke up in the hospital and realized that I hadn't done very much for the world except try to make a lot of money quite early on. So I was only 23 at that time. But I'd also suffered quite a lot of injustice by that time. You know, going to England as a young man, I'd been beaten up 3 times for my color. I'd also started working for a wonderful company called Clark's. I was buying shoes for Clark's from India. And my hotel bill for one night is more than what the workers earned for a week. So I moved out of my hotel and started living with the shoe workers, the caste called the Jatavs, and in their slum, and really realized what the life of a very poor person is, and what are not just the economic injustices they face, but the caste discrimination and etc. So after coming out of hospital, I decided to sort of change my reality a bit and try to understand why are poor people poor and why rich countries rich and what is the relationship. And I went back to university to study development studies. But I also thought that politics is the most important element of to sort of the engine of change and the engine of and what is controlling us. So I got became a sort of political activist. And that's the time when Gandhi became very, very important to me, because Gandhiji both was a political activist, but also a great visionary in terms of a more ideal society. And I did my university thesis on Gandhian economics, thinking how can we develop an economic system that would be starting from the poor and starting from the ingenuity and the wisdom culture and the innovation of everyone, of the poor and how to build up a society rather than only based on technology and some sort of a elitist intelligence. So Gandhi became, and I can come back to Gandhi later why that happened. But then I went to jail, organized things, very much as a Gandhian activist, and then I burnt out. And in that burning out, I went on a search for about 6-7 years, trying to find a way of being peace rather than just fighting for peace. And in that search, I went to Sufis and Hindu teachers and Quakers and all sorts of different traditions, tribal teachers. And I slowly found myself, finding myself to the Dhamma or Buddha Dhamma. And the Buddha effectively at that point became my sort of teacher. And that is the second person I felt who was important to me, both coming from my Indic civilizational roots, both Gandhi and of course the Buddha. What the Buddha taught me was 2 or 3 things which were important. One was that there's a primacy of suffering. There is suffering. I'd seen this in jail. I'd seen this with the poor. I'd seen this in my own life. And we have to start there. We can't ignore that, but don't wallow in it so much, but use the suffering as a compost for transformation and also realization. And of course, to develop our compassion and our love for ourselves and others. So that is one element. The other element I liked about the Buddha very much, which was sort of counter to how I've been brought up in India, was that he didn't believe in the idea of an Atma, an individuated self, an inherently individuated self. Now, this is very deeply embedded in Indian culture. It's not just Hindus, it's everyone. Oh, in my past life, this happened. And so we are very fated. We have a lot of fatedness. And it's a wonderful philosophic social structure to believe in, because everything works out. I'm lame in this life because I must have kicked somebody in my last life or whatever. But the Buddha never said that. The Buddha said there's nothing like that. Everything is interdependent. Everything is connected. So that I liked very much, because I'd also seen caste discrimination and how the society justified, hereditary non-privilege. So I think that element I liked about the Buddha very much. And the third element I liked very much about the Buddha was the element that there was some degree of self-reliance, that you could decide to some degree. There were lots of causes and conditions, but you could you could sort of choose your response, an appropriate response to anything that happened. And that happened through mind training. And through emotional literacy in a sort of way. And so the fourth element, which I liked very much, which became my path, was the practice of mindfulness. So while I was searching around, I went to also Burmese and Japanese and Korean teachers. And then in 1987, I was sort of bumming around the US in California, like a sort of Indian hippie trying to find my spiritual path. So you have to go out of your habituated environment to find those things sometimes. And I met this man who was a gentle Vietnamese Zen master leading an artist retreat. And on the second day of the retreat, he shared the path of walking meditation, practice of walking meditation. And I remember we were walking in those, I can't remember the hill's name, it's the Shumash Indian area in the Ojai Hills. And I really felt, for the first time in my life, I really touched peace. I felt that this experience of peace, not just as an idea. And then I realized that it's a practice. And then I felt that he could be my guide for the foreseeable future. And that was more than 30 years ago. And so Thich Nhat Hanh then became a very important, my sort of wise friend, teacher, and guide over the last 30 years.
Oh.
And so I can come back to that also as we, and then of course, he then in 88, he took me to all the places associated with the Buddha, and on a pilgrimage, which the Buddha had suggested that people do as a practice.
Wow.
And at the end of the journey, he said, why don't you do this every year? This is something Buddha suggested in the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, and take people with you. So I feel very blessed that he gave me a sort of practice. And every year since then, I went on pilgrimage. I would work in the social development world. I worked in Oxfam, World Wildlife Fund, the UN for 15 years, the UN Development Program. But every winter, I would go on a pilgrimage. That would be my practice. And slowly in 1999, my wife and I decided we didn't want to earn as bureaucrats or earn money from the UN. So I started taking $1 a year from the UN. I carried on working with them, and I tried to make my livelihood in the marketplace. So I transformed this practice of pilgrimage into a right livelihood.
Wow.
And it fitted my interests in travel, in transformation, in being a sort of cultural and pedestrian ambassador to India, which I love. So there were also elements which suited me. And I feel it's been a wonderful practice, because what Thich Nhat Hanh did to me was brought the Buddha alive as a human being. And when I was brought up in India, I've been thinking of Buddha as some sort of godlike figure. Right. So he literally took me by the hand and said, he sat here, he saw the sunset, he sat in this cave, he walked across this. And slowly that practice became more and more important. I can share about that. And then, of course, I became part of what his community, or the Sangha, which has been his great gift also, to meet other. It wasn't an individuated relationship only, but it became part of a sort of organism that he's created. And I feel I have brothers and sisters, and in our world, and a deep understanding of the Dhamma, or the deepening understanding of the Dhamma, I should say. You realize that there's no separation between you and the cloud, or the person in Mozambique, or somebody who's starving and who's getting shot in Syria, or somebody who's a arms dealer in India. So I mean that's a sort of introduction. Sorry, I went a bit long, so I was sure, but anyway, I can go on any theme you want. But since you mentioned the three key people in my life, I thought I'd just introduce them, how they came into my life.
Oh, it's wonderful, Shantum, and I know you've taken us very deep already, and it really, this is as much the people who are watching have heard so much from me already. It's so wonderful to have you share what your spiritual path has been, what the path of your life has been, and I'm certainly curious about each of those relationships that you had with Gandhi and Buddha, largely through your kind of a visionary relationship, really, with them, and with but grounded in both land and the earth and their ideas, and but also your very personal relationship with Thich Nhat Hanh, which is inspiring, and of course he's been an inspiring figure for many people in the West as well, which is quite wonderful. So I'm
very much the father of mindfulness, actually, and which has now become a very common currency or a practice in the West.
Yes,
of course, it is something which was started by the Buddha. Well, started by many traditions, I would say, but the Buddha articulated it very clearly in the first teaching he gave at the deer park in Sarnath, where he talked about right mindfulness as one of the eightfold paths.
Exactly. Yeah. Wonderful, Shantum. And so I'm wondering. I mean, this is all lovely, and we could go in so many different arenas and for hours, I think, on this. I'm curious about so many things. I got so many questions, but one of them is about this this intermingling, and even Thich Nhat Hanh, of course, had it, but this intermingling between really deep spiritual practice and the circumstances that we find ourselves in the world. We started off, you were reflecting for a moment on the golden civilization and talking about a term, and I didn't quite catch it, that Gandhi used for Raja, for the for his vision of an ideal civilization. Yeah. And I loved your framing of all of this as coming from the grassroots, coming from ordinary people, coming from poverty, really, and moving upward. But each of these figures had their own relationship to that condition of suffering, and both Thich Nhat Hanh and Gandhi came more in our time, where hierarchies of power have grown. Not only do we have governments, but we've got all kinds of corporations and nonprofits and all of these places that can be problematic in and of themselves. And the Buddha didn't have much of that to encounter at the time. So I'm just wondering.
Oh, no, he had enough of it.
He had enough of it. He did.
Yeah, I mean, and that's what's interesting, because technologically we may have moved quite a lot.
Yes.
But in our psychological and emotional and relational spaces, we haven't moved very much at all. I mean, the sort of jealousies and angers and the violence which is being perpetrated right through, and the Buddha trying to be the sort of apostle of non-violence, sitting on Vulture Peak, knowing that there's injustice going on in the city of Rajgir, which was the capital of the Magadha kingdom at the time, but being a sort of witness, without supporting the unjust, and things like this, and waiting for the right moment till that king Ajatashatru then became a disciple of the Buddha later, and then he confessed his patricide, killing his father, etc. So I think I would say that things like this have been going on for many years, for centuries, and since human beings have been around. Maybe we have more of a technological ability to destroy the world, and maybe things like climate change, maybe. But we think that even things like climate change, for other reasons, may have happened before. We've had civilizations in India like the Harappan and Mohenjo-daro civilizations, which were there 3,500 years before the Common Era. And one of the reasons we think it may have disappeared is because of this type of climate change that may have happened at that time. And not human constructed, but some other reasons. So, but anyway, no, I think the word that I was looking, it's called Ram Rajya. And I actually thought I might quote him, because I actually wrote it down. And this is Gandhi's vision of Ram Rajya. And what he said is a land of dharma, and a realm of peace and harmony and happiness for young and old, high and low, all creatures and the earth itself, in recognition of a shared universal consciousness. Now, this was Gandhi writing in the 1920s, 30s, and he was very careful to say this is not a Hindu Rajya. The Ram is considered a Hindu god, right. But he said whether it's Ram or Rahim, which is another name for the Islamic god, he said it doesn't matter. It's just the word Ram is for God. And so he had this vision, and then of course he realized by the time independence came in India that this was still a dream, and Gandhi was very clear that he didn't want to, in his whole structuring of his political and his philosophic life, he tried not to distinguish between means and ends. The means were the ends, and therefore this Ram Rajya didn't manifest in the way that he wanted to. Maybe India got its political freedom, but it was not the freedom that he was really looking for. His freedom was a much deeper sense of human and species justice.
Yeah. And why do you think he thought that didn't happen, and what needed to go forward from there?
Yeah, I think it was to do with he was a bit of what he calls himself a practical idealist. But I think that it was a state where we could aspire if we all moved our consciousness to a level where we, as you've written in your book, we aspire to happiness and freedom and peace as a collective, and we see the happiness and peace and freedom of the other as yours. Yeah. I think we are so caught up with our me, mine, I, whether it's an identity of a nation state or a religion or a clan or a gender. So I think that's been the main issue with that. And Gandhi was going further. He was pushing the realm of what a human being, or the human potential.
Right.
And most of us are not going there.
Yeah.
And what is interesting for me when I went to California in 86, 87, I found there was an aspiration for a sort of, it's been there all throughout civilization, but I felt there was an aspirational thing. People even call it the human potential movement, I think, at one point. So I think it's a collective thing. It's a global phenomenon, but we have to network and connect. And I think one of the things I liked in your book, and I feel, which is important, what I'm involved in a lot actually, is the whole area of education. I realized when I was 50, I realized that I've been working in social development. So I realized at that point that it wasn't social development and political systems that is going to change the world. It is going to be a shift in consciousness. And the most effective way to do this is with young people and through the field of education. And there are lots and lots of things to do in education, but one of the key elements to transmit in education is the understanding of interconnectedness and interdependence, or what we call dependent origination, which is a Buddhist realization. But again, it's an ecological realization too. I mean, anybody who's interested in deep ecology and whether it's climate change, you realize that we are so interconnected that there's nothing which is independently happening. So I think that one element, if it's imbued into a global education system, is important. But it doesn't happen until you can become more centered, you can become more reflective, you can become more present. And that's why mindfulness as a practice is so important as a pedagogical approach, that faculty of awareness, and the sort of non-judgmental awareness. And it's an energy. It's not just a mind state. It's an energy that you cultivate through eating, walking. It's not just sitting on a cushion. It's everything you do. You're cultivating that energy of mindfulness. And I feel when you do that, you start realizing more and more that everything is interconnected. Whether it's your breath, as you breathe in and out, you realize the tree is breathing and the friends are breathing. And in Delhi today, we have such phenomenally bad air. It's severe, hazardous. It's clear we're all in a gas chamber right now, in a sort of way.
Right.
I think, but again, we also have to realize the suffering of others in our city. It's not just my suffering. Everyone's. So I think this sort of realization of interconnectedness is very important, and beyond Delhi and beyond India, to embrace the universe and the world, and as far as we can, even the stars. I mean, if we know the moon determines tides, what is happening, and if the moon is not separate to us. So that sort of thing is very important. And I think that comes very much from a Buddhist or a sort of Indic civilizational pedagogical approach.
Yes. Yes. So so interesting, Shantum. We, as you probably have gathered from our few talks and looking at the book, one of the practices of mindfulness that I've taken very, very deep to heart and thought a lot about, but mostly practiced with, is a practice looking at impermanence, what the Buddha called anicca in Pali.
Yeah.
And not merely impermanence, but trying to experience the present moment. It's really a reflection. It's a profound practice because it's totally experiential, and yet it's about the nature of time itself. And time is certainly one of the things, if not the thing, that kind of does connect us and everything. And we only ever experience the present moment. So one of the things that has been growing inside of me from that practice is just a recognition that every time an electron leaps its orbit, it's making that decision, if you can call it that in anthropomorphic terms. It's making that decision based on the pressures around it in regard to the present moment. And
Yeah,
and
I
that,
think you're sorry.
and that present moment is there for every single entity, however small, however large, in the universe. That interconnectedness, and it's experiential. And who's to say that our experience of that is that much different from any of these other creatures or processes?
Yeah, I mean, who knows what level of consciousness even a stone has. But I think what you're talking about, the deep wisdom of impermanence, anicca, is the sort of the other side of the coin of anatta, or non-self.
Totally.
And to have the realization of transience, that everything is in constant flow. You can never step in the same river once because the river is moving. I think that's important, but you see that in the context of time.
Right.
What anatta does is see that in the context of space. So you then bring time and space together with these two friends of anicca and anatta. So the interdependence, or the non-self, and the impermanence. And I see that more emphasized, anicca is more emphasized in what is the Theravada traditions, or the Pali tradition, and the Mahayana tradition, the Sanskrit traditions, tend to emphasize more the anatta, the impermanence, the interdependence or interconnectedness. But I think they're both basically the same thing, but using a different language of experience, using time and space.
In some ways, I hate to get too abstract with our audience, but I'm also very, very curious. So as you describe anatta, and which is selflessness, or sometimes called emptiness, but when you describe it in terms of space, and anicca, which is often translated as impermanence, obviously in terms of time, how are you thinking of this work with self and selflessness having to do with space? Is it because of the way we populate the past and the future with our attachments to I, me, and mine, or is there some other frame that you have of space in terms of?
Yeah, I think one of the nicest descriptions is what we call Indra's net, where each node in that net reflects every other node.
Yeah.
So it's like a huge web, and then each. So I think that's a good description. That gives it a sense of a spatial dimension across. So yeah, and in that everything is transient. So I think trying to catch those two. But it's a sort of a, as you said, with the experience of impermanence or anicca, it's an experience. You realize that when you're eating something, eating a bean, if you eat it with full awareness, you realize that this bean is an ambassador of the cosmos. Yeah. It has the sunshine, the rain, the farmer, the earth, the clouds, everything in that one bean. And if you take out the cloud or the rain or the earth or the farmer, that bean doesn't exist as it exists. Right. And that gives you a very good sense of that spacious correlation that we have with everything that exists. Yeah. So I think now when we talk about things like ecological crises and things like this, it's much more clear to us that the action is sometimes even a thought of one person in one part of the earth is affecting somebody else somewhere else very deeply.
Beautiful. There was just I just put on Facebook the other day a theory that is now, it's basically Indra's net, a theory coming out of physics right now, that even the smallest of entities is really a mini universe, opens up into a universe. Really quite a wonderful a vision that comes from the Hindu.
Yes. So that's what you were alluding to by the electron moving and. Yeah,
yes.
I mean, everything is contained in everything else, and that's what it is. Each thing, you can say, you can meditate on a hair. We think, okay, what's the point of meditating on a hair or meditating on my hand or anything? Yeah. You take any object, you meditate, you realize deeply when you penetrate into it, that it's actually, it teaches you about interconnectedness.
Yeah. So Shantum, you have a very strong perspective on education. I want to talk just briefly about this in closing. I'd like to frame it if I could, because at the end of a golden civilization conversation, we start with a grand vision, and then we look at all the obstacles, and then we look at, well, what action steps can we take? And I think you've got some really concrete. You'll be interested in hearing that, in fact, all across civilization so far, and I've just traveled obviously a very small portion of it, and mostly relatively privileged, but in many countries all over the world, what comes up as the major obstacle is ourselves, and is our attachment to ourselves. This attachment is greed, is desire, and fear. Certainly there's a play of structural politics and corporate, news media and all the rest, but hugely arrogance and self play a very significant role in how ordinary people all over the world are thinking of what the problem is, and how we need, and that we need to address it in one way or another. And I think they're less clear about this than you are. And I want to bring up one other thing in the context of the golden civilization conversations that I've led, and I've led probably 60 or 70. There have been several hundred that have occurred all over the world. Many of them, of course, I've not participated in. But one of the other major themes, I mean, I think a lot about mindfulness as being something that could be hugely transformative at the base, but that also we need some structural systemic changes, because we have not found a single hierarchy of power in the 250 years since the Industrial Revolution that has wisdom at its peak and that permeates wisdom all the way down, in contrast to your permeating it up, which it'd be lovely to go both ways, of course. But so one of my terms for that, just coming out of the financial world that I wrestle with in America in particular, but also in Western countries, is the fiduciary responsibility that a corporation should have to all shareholders. Again, Indra's net in terms of that fiduciary responsibility. But so that's a lot my frame. But but as you know, education is very important to me. And what's been wonderful as I've traveled the world is that education comes up everywhere. And it's really important. People aren't sure exactly what they mean and where to go with it. But what I love about what you said is that you think that the interconnectedness, and I don't want to just label it interconnectedness, but when we were talking about what could change, what could win Gandhi's Ram Raja into the world, you said education could be it, basically. And I'm wondering if you were to design education for our children, starting from however young you started and going however old, what do you think the shifts would be that you would design that you think would indeed give us the greatest likelihood of experiencing this golden civilization, this Ram Raja, this vision of Indra's net, and the experience of it inside our lives?
Yeah, I think before going that, it's not a one solution for everything, and we have to look at all these structural things like media, like research, like legal systems, like social organizations. So they all go together. I'm just thinking that education has the greatest potency right now, and it can shift a collective consciousness.
Right.
I feel that one of the things is, I was talking to somebody a few days ago, and they were saying, how do we design a school? And I said, one thing you must do is somewhere in the center of the school is have a tree or have a silent space, a space where that can become a place where people can come and reflect and practice. Because modern education systems are always stuffing information into you, and there's no place to reflect or practice. If you look at the old Indian pedagogical system, like in Nalanda University, you had halls of study and where people stayed, and right across that, you had chaitya halls, what you call like place of practice. It could be chanting, it could be breathing, it could be different Sorry, that is my phone falling down.
Take your,
It was, yeah, sorry, I'll have to get it back onto some sort of,
yeah,
is
yeah,
that okay?
yeah,
Yeah.
it's wonderful. Yeah.
So
Halls or some kind of place of practice in addition to,
I think some place, so we can combine study and practice. I think that's very important. That
yeah,
it's not just study, study, study. The other element, of course, we have physical and intellectual development, but we must have emotional development.
yeah,
One of the reasons I've got involved in this is because I realized that I never learned how to handle my emotions when I was a kid, and then I made a mess, whether it was jealousy or anger. And this is something which is key, that we understand how our emotions work, and then also how our mind works. How does our how does our brain work? Once we understand that, and this is luckily with a lot of research in neuroplasticity and now in epigenetics and things, we are realizing how the structure of our body and mind is working. So children and teachers should be taught that. So a lot of our emphasis is on teacher training. One thing we're doing a lot of teacher training, bringing it into national curriculum, all these things in India. But the other thing I'm doing personally, which I find is hugely important, is giving people experiences outside of their normal habituated environment.
yeah.
So, for example, I do these trips for children from, for example, Phillips Exeter or Groton to India, and giving them a very much a cultural immersion into a very different reality, so that they realize that their culture is not the only paradigm that we need to live in. It's not a monoculture. They're as sophisticated and also as legitimate cultures, whether they're in a tribal community or whether they're in a Gangetic plains or whether. So I think that understanding of the human diversity, and I think of India as a civilization. I don't think of it as a country. So I really think of this. So immersing yourself in a different civilization is key, because we are already getting narrowed down by walls,
Yeah.
whether it's through visas or whether it's through some political posturing. So I think the element of young people and all of us having to travel. I know there are problems with climate change, with airlines, but we have to cultivate. I really believe in the human ingenuity and the innovations we can come up with in terms of protecting our planet. I have no doubt. Only if we just put our energy and the bottom line was peace and happiness. And I tell teachers, I often ask heads of school, I say, what do you bring your children up for? And, it's quite interesting. They might say it's a career, it's a job. But when you dig more deeply, they realize, no, it's for the welfare and the well-being of these young people. Well, then look at the school education from that lens. What is it? What are the life skills they need to lead a happy, peaceful, and a life where they can. So now we've always known how to develop compassion, how to develop mindfulness, how to develop empathy. We never teach those things. And so those are the elements. So some years ago, when I was saying I was 50, my wife and I, Gitu and I, decided that first we thought maybe we set up a school. Then we realized it'll be very narrow. But so what we're doing now is just, we have a trust called Ahimsa Trust. We've tried to train more than 3,000 teachers now in different schools. Wow. And trying to create model schools of and thousands of students. And it's not just us, we're part of the Wake Up movement, which is part of Thich Nhat Hanh's community. So we invite monks and nuns and lay teachers to come to India every year, do these national workshops, and follow up with students and with teachers. And I think it's creating a big shift in the culture of these schools. And we don't only take teachers, we take administrators, we take the cooks. We feel that lots of schools, initially I think schools are sort of like in India, they were like what you call Gurukul. You would go to the guru's home and study whatever he or she taught you. Then later it became more like a sort of places where religious studies were taught. Then maybe more like the military. But we've forgotten the roots of education, how to, it wasn't just it was life skills. And now what's happening, George, is interesting. Because information is so readily available from the internet, the role of the teacher is changing. Because the kids have more information with the touch of a finger than he can ever or she can ever teach. So that is very important. And what are they modeling? So we always say the unwritten curriculum is the presence of the teacher in the class. But then how do you teach that. It's not teaching presence. It is being.
Right. Right.
And that being transmits love or transmits, a spaciousness.
Wisdom, kindness.
Yeah.
Truth.
And in Buddhism, it's very clear that, you have mindfulness, concentration, insight, which are the three sort of bases, which leads to wisdom.
Yeah.
So it's not that you're just plucking wisdom out of saying, I want to be wise. You say, here's a very clear way of practicing mindfulness, developing concentration. It's not like teachers saying concentrate. You can learn concentration, get insight through reflection.
Yeah.
And then the wisdom, the pyramidal structure you were talking about, wisdom will flow. I don't actually see it like that. I see the wisdom coming from the grassroots, from the earth, from the grass.
Yeah.
And I know there was one thing which when I was looking at the book, which is lying with me now here, I had an issue with one issue, which was the idea that people are born equal. I don't think people are born equal. We should offer equal opportunities. And this idea of equality is actually a bit of an impediment to a civilizational shift. And I know it's a very strong thing in the West, but I think, we talk about a superiority complex or inferiority complex. There's also an equality complex. And I think we have to be careful that we have to encourage each other in whatever gifts or whatever propensity we have, but not to expect people to be cookie cutter like that. So equality is quite a dangerous flag to keep on the mast.
Yeah.
When I was reading your book, I felt I had a little issue with that, but that's we can have offline if you prefer.
Well, no, I think that you've been so inspiring, Shantum, and I don't know that I disagree with you much at all there.
Okay.
One of my main heroes in the West was William Blake, and one of the things he felt very much the same. He felt that what we were doing by looking just simply at equality is that we were missing the genius, the brilliance, the depth, the wisdom that came out of really years of practice or work that people had done or development that people had done themselves, and that we really needed to look at what is best, what's most extraordinary in human nature, and seek to bring it everywhere. So I don't know that we'd have much real disagreement there.
Okay.
There's a lot of talk right now about equality because the culture of hierarchies of power have made us in many ways as human beings much less powerful. And so that's where really, I think for me, the issue of equality comes up, is that
then I think this ideal of political systems which are consensual are very important for learning how to listen. In fact, the Buddha's time, I feel the political systems were based around consensus decision making. And that's why he was such a good listener. His father was a politician, was a king.
Yeah.
And so he learned listening skills. And that became part of his. So I think in each generation, we also have a civilizational pedagogy. It's not somebody pops it out of the hat. Buddha was a product of his time, 2,600 years ago. Gandhi was a product of his time, 700 years ago, 150 years ago, he was born exactly this year. Thich Nhat Hanh was a product of his time and all the Vietnamese war and everything like that. And he's come out of that, become a lotus out of the sea of fire, which is the title of one of his books. And so I think we also, and our children and our daughters, are all products of a particular time. And so it's a sort of mystery how we will re-emerge or create this golden civilization. Yeah. But I think hope is very important.
It is.
And despair is the killer.
Yeah.
And I think connecting with friends like you and people, we realize that it's possible. There's no reason why, we can live very rich lives very simply.
Right.
And there's enough for everyone's needs on this planet.
Yes. Yeah. Shantum, very inspiring to talk with you.
Yeah.
I hope I'm sure other people are going to feel the same. Perhaps we can do this again sometime, maybe, and go further with the conversation. But this has been wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George, and thank you for doing what you're doing and keeping this, awake to the world.
There are so many wonderful thoughts that you've come up with to share that I know many people are going to find great richness from, Shantum. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I look forward to seeing you soon. My friend.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.